So I think people really have to get locked in that at the end of the day, this tool is pretty much for everybody. Certainly, there are a few things that it's not going to do well at, but spend a little bit of free play and due diligence. Check it out. When people say, John, is this going to steal my job? My advice is always this: do your research. Go in, spend an hour, and see if it applies to you and what you do, right? If the answer is yes, read more. If the answer is no, this doesn't really apply to me, check back in 6 months, because in 6 months it might apply to you. And
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. We have a special guest today, John King. John, where are you calling from today?
calling from Charleston, South Carolina in the United States.
Fantastic. John, for people who may not know your background yet, can you share how you get into the immersive technology and what led you into the building VictoryXR?
Yeah, well, my background varies. I spent most of my adult life overseas working in international business, academia, as well as working in government relations and large multinational projects. That being said, no one, I think, in the modern era can ignore the pace and churn of technology. And I think for me, what led me here in my current role at VictoryXR is being present at a academic institution during the pandemic and seeing how much chaos that caused, and the idea that there must be a better way to do this, right? There must be a way to deliver learning objectives to students in a way that not only is comprehensive, but ideally enjoyable as well. So that's what led me to this role as the director of the education and enterprise divisions. And to be honest, I don't have a graduate degree in a hard skill science, but I think collectively I was able to triangulate a lot of professional experience to bring together in this role that I currently reside in.
For sharing. VictoryXR has become one of the most recognized names in the metaverse and XR education. What was the original vision behind the company?
Well, the original vision came from the visionary founder, Steve Grubbs, that he, about a decade ago was in the Iowa State Legislature and was leading up the education panel. And at that time, if we all remember back, there were some nascent technologies that was being introduced to education. And, probably all remember Sergey Brin and his Google glasses and some of the other stuff that was just kind of poking the surface. Many will be familiar with things like Second Life, which was kind of a precursor to a lot of the immersive environments you see now. And he believed in the vision that, again, technology is a vessel and tool for empowerment, equity, and accessibility. And coming from Iowa, which is a pretty rural state, you got a lot of land with a little bit of people, and you got to provide resources so that they can be successful. So that's where the vision began, and it's grown over the last decade to encompass work in hundreds of schools, colleges, universities in more than 50 countries.
Was there a specific moment where you realized XR could fundamentally change education, not just enhance it?
Yeah, I think the moment for me came when, and this is just personal in nature, but it came for me when I was trying to teach during the pandemic with cohorts of Chinese students who, in effect, had started to migrate back to China given the challenges of the pandemic and the program they were attending in the States. So working across, a dozen time zones, right? In geographic distances and trying to piece together some sort of experience that was comparable to what we had face to face. And for me, I realized that with the current tools that institutions were using, that was nearly impossible. That, in the modern era, we all live with the expectation of having everything available 24/7. The solution at the time was, well, let's just record some Zoom calls and that'll do it. I think that was highly disappointing for a lot of students, and a lot of academic institutions realized this and decided they needed to adapt and change.
It's almost like you need a little, a record scratch and a background behind the camera voice, but that did not do it, right?
Yeah, I think, again, change is scary. Everywhere in everybody's life, they have things that they hold on to with some sense of permanence. Problem is, that's not reflective of real life evolution and the modern technological environment. So everyone has to make compromises in their own lives. The question is, what compromises are you willing to make? And I think that's a question that a lot of academics have not really sat down and thought deeply about.
Absolutely. Um, especially during the pandemic era. What does a typical day look like for you as the leader of the company operating at the intersection of education, VR, and emerging technology?
Yeah, well, I think in the modern era, particularly when you work in the remote sphere, my day starts in East Asia and ends in California. So, in the mornings, I'll be working with people from Bangladesh, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Japan. And then as we work across the day in the Eastern time zone, I'll start working with Europe, late morning, and then eventually get to California in the evenings. It is truly global in nature. And again, we live in a small world fundamentally, and that we're all connected now. I think that's the beauty of the technology is it creates that connectivity and ability for collaboration. And then throughout those meetings, we're anywhere from advancing programs we've been helping clients run for years. That could be large scale, thousands and thousands of students using our software at a major US institution, to a new community program in Lagos, Nigeria, trying to integrate technologies to local communities to give them some sense and advantage towards the technologies that are widely used in the rest of the world. So it can span a full gamut from Fortune 1000 projects to a new local community initiative.
From your perspective, what are the biggest shifts happening right now in education technology and immersive learning?
I think the biggest shifts that we're seeing currently is really people struggling with some sense the lay of the land as it currently sits, but also what that portends going forward in the future. And again, we're all selfish creatures by nature. So typically that assessment of those changes starts from a subjective and personal view. Right. And of course, the one that everyone asks these days is this new advancement going to take my job? Right. I think that's in the back of a lot of people's heads. So the changes are occurring at a rate, and we look at AI doubling its capacity every 7 months. I might spend 7 months getting one meeting together with five faculty members. And what I see is an increasing delta between the pace of technology and its change rate and people's decision making timelines. And eventually that delta is going to be so great. I don't know if it's going to be overcome, but the ones who are staying with it, right? You see a move towards mixed modalities. You see a move towards, creating accessibility across device platform, creating equity in that space, regardless of whether a VR headset or a tablet, and really being non-localized in nature. This is probably the biggest movement, which is for so long we were constrained by physical structures in terms of anchoring resources in those physical structures. And that would be an example of a innovation lab on a campus, for example. Now we all have these little black boxes. And the modern expectation is that I have access to my resources 24 365. I think that's where most people's heads are at, except for people who often revert back to conservative or comforting experiences of the past, right? Resistant to that change. But I think it's pretty clear to me where it's going, which is in the full non-local distribution of technology and information.
That's a very valid point. With Apple Vision Pro, MetaQuest, and spatial computing gaining traction, where do you see XR adoption in education over the next 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, well, I think we got to premise it on where it is currently. And I think it's no mystery that aviation, flight training, health sciences, they've been using immersive technologies for decades now. The question is, what's going to be the adoption rate in these other industries and fields and sectors that kind of catalyze or I guess remove the inclination to adopt these technologies? So as we see these schools kind of currently, many institutions are still in a trial phase, right? They're, you might say, doing their due diligence. I would argue sometimes that's ineffective given the scope and scale and the goals associated with the project. I think you're going to see a continuation of immersive learning focusing in pretty niche areas because that coincides with how bureaucracies are structured and budgets are distributed. For example, if I'm the head of the chemistry department, I don't care what the art history department's doing. It's never been a concern for me. My funding doesn't come from them, nor any sense of collaboration with them. So there's still very much a selfish nature in the usage of this vis-a-vis the expertise that is being, I guess, applied by that individual or group or department. I think where it eventually will lead to is people realizing that this technology at the end of the day is subject matter agnostic. So much is that you can use it to teach anything. And we're starting to see that expand. An analogy would be, someone declaring that, well, a calculator is only good for math class. Don't you use a calculator in statistics and biology and chemistry? And you don't have to open up your blinders too far to see that a lot of these technologies, underpinning them is their versatility. And unfortunately, that's counterintuitive to a professional like myself who spent many years focusing in a very narrow discipline. So I think the expansion and application will continue to grow and evolve laterally. But for the near term, I think it's going to be focused in specialization, right? Recreating complicated, intricate, difficult processes that otherwise would be expensive, dangerous, or inconvenient to be done in real life.
Many universities and institutions are experiencing or experimenting with the metaverse campuses. What are they getting right, and what are they misunderstanding?
Yeah. Well, digital twins are interesting in many respects. And I think they've evolved from what we would call maybe a static digital twin, which is a recreation of a space or place, but it doesn't have the physics involved in it to a large degree. For example, I might build a digital twin of a student center, but maybe I don't make the water fountains work. And the reason why is that, okay, if the water fountains do work and we spend time in that, what value is that adding to the experience? Right? That just like we often don't build in working bathrooms and fire escapes, they're superfluous. They're really not of any value in building out those digital twins. So that's where most people have been. And we create them for schools to do teaching, recruitment, remedial studies, student group meetings, or use them synchronously or asynchronously to create an environment of your own choosing. I think where it is moving is people are more interested in creating full digital twins with simulators embedded within them. So, what I mean by that is maybe a school wants to recreate a particle physics lab. Pretty easy to create that static environment, but they want a particle accelerator inside that physics lab. That's where you start to entail movements and actions and reactions in what's happening within these tools. And to recreate those, we call that a simulator. So I think you're going to see more simulator based digital twins moving forward here in the next couple of years. And for good reason. It gives you a more comprehensive and realistic exposure to that environment. You can actually manipulate, adjust, and work through elements with physics and interactions. And I think that's going to be a great opportunity anywhere from construction safety to high-end, science experiments to alleviate the danger or the cost that would be associated with doing it in the real world.
How do you see AI intersecting with immersive language environments?
Well, personally, I think, someone who speaks multiple languages, the boon in AI vis-a-vis language recognition and anything related to that, language learning, translation, copywriting, it's incredible. If you look at how that's being applied, one, we can already see it impacting in things like tourism, right? Where you can walk around with your phone and you can have a conversation, right? Literally in real time with two people who are mutually unintelligible. I think how that applies in the immersive learning spaces, it's going to be like many other things, an accelerant, like pouring gas on the fire, that you can, in a moment's notice, get translations, iterations, related material, recommendation, and real-time feedback around pronunciation, grammar, syntax. It's opened a lot of doors, and it's, I think, flattened a lot of the obstacles and barriers that traditionally were present in international business, education, and many other fields. It's an incredible tool.
It's kind of funny. I have a story. A friend of mine yesterday mentioned that at his company, they deployed a cloud bot to respond to emails. And one of the clients responded in Spanish. And then the cloud bot continued the conversation in Spanish until the client booked the call. Now, nobody in their company speaks Spanish. So the client will be expecting somebody to speak Spanish on the other side when they take that call.
Probably right. And, I think that's, just given that example, I think with good customer service, it's probably something that you can overcome. But I think we're still in this phase where there are many people who are not aware that that can be done. And, I'll give you an example of per the Claude, experiment that the ability to create agentic AI avatars that have particular tasks associated with their mission and directive. You can essentially build your own team in agentic AI to work on contracts, an agentic AI to fill out grant proposals, an agentic AI to do the marketing and lead gen. And you're going to see more of this crop up as influenced by a couple factors. One, obviously the cost, right? Two, I think there's a fair question to be asked, and it's affecting certainly employment for entry level roles. Is it more effective to have us do this with an agentic AI, or should we hire someone new? So it's going to create some churn at the entry level positions, but I don't think you can disagree with the impact that it can make and the potential.
Absolutely. And I think we're actually in a new paradigm where $1 billion evaluation companies with one person is a real possibility.
Yeah, I agree. I read that the other day, and I think they were spot on the mark, which is, if you have the ability, as someone who's savvy with this technology, have a little bit of coding skills, you can create your own army of workers. Now granted, garbage in, garbage out, which is you got to make sure that there's some good structure. But again, the possibilities, seem at this moment almost limitless.
As long as you're not paying more for tokens than you're getting paid back. That's one feature
That's
of it.
true.
What does a VictoryXR current ecosystem look like today? Products, platforms, and the type of institutions you work with.
Yeah, so our platform, at the end of the day, I'd say we're an educational software company, but to make it simple. And we have an app called VXR Labs that embodies, kind of the full set of our tools and the licensure. And, to give people an idea of who we work with, we have four main areas of interest and partners. So we have higher education, we have enterprise, and those are the two that I largely, work with and lead, but we also have a K through 12 and homeschool division. And in combination, you're looking at, individual users, hundreds of schools and school districts and colleges, ultimately, they're trying to improve the outcomes of their students, or trainees, I guess, if you look into the corporate space. Well, the way that we do that is, sometimes predictive, others reactive. And I'm referencing how we develop products. I think that if you look at the current lay of the land in America, jobs wise, there's tons of trade jobs that are going unfilled, and they're also in high demand and good money to be made. I don't know if you have any friends in the trades, but all mine who own plumbing companies and electrical companies, they're doing great, much better than some of my friends who borrowed a lot of money for an undergrad degree.
Man, yeah.
Yeah, that's, I'm still paying off student loans for reference. So, looking at, you know, how we support them is one, I think when you're asking people, how are you going to use this technology? You're assuming that they're coming from a position of being informed and understanding it. And what I think with new technologies got to keep in mind is that one, if someone doesn't know, right, that's not a ding against them. I call that a teachable moment, right? So for new products like ours, oftentimes you're educating people before you're even broaching the idea of selling it to them. Right? Because if someone doesn't understand what something can and cannot do, they don't have a good foundation for decision making. So largely we're educators in this space as well around what's possible here. And we're always in the mindset of discussing the art of the possible is important. Beyond that, we do things that AI teaching assistants, patient simulators, high-end single player, multiplayer simulations focused in specific areas like crime scene investigation or particle physics. And then if none of that hits the mark, then you have the ability to basically create your own scenarios to a degree. There are limits in the physics that you can, I guess, create yourself, or you could have us do it. And we build custom simulations for very specific projects all the time. So pretty wide gamut across those four verticals about what we do and how we work with people. But no company, no partner too small or too big. And, again, it all starts with a discussion.
Yeah, coming back to the topic of education, I can only imagine what are some people experiencing. The people that got their college degrees in programming, they have a lot of debt, and most of the coding jobs are now gone to AI. So it's a pretty morbid reality for those people. What types of schools, organizations adopt XR the fastest, and which tend to struggle?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll stick with higher ed for the minute and, kind of articulate that. I think, one, there's some general trend lines if I look back at my tenure over the last 5 years. I think recently there's some environmental factors and market factors that have compounded the general trend lines and thrown it in a little bit of chaos. Generally speaking, most schools that are going to adopt and try VR, in a more rapid pace are R1 institutes. And those are top tier research universities. Typically, every state has one or two of them. I went to one, University of Georgia, right? So they're receive large amounts of funding for research. The other schools are private schools. They have less state and federal oversight around how monies are being spent to try new technologies. So typically they can move a little bit faster. So that can be anywhere from, a school like Harvard that everyone probably knows to a smaller private liberal arts school like Loyola Marymount, for example. I think beyond that, some environmental factors that have kind of changed the game a little bit is the current federal administration's perceived war on higher ed, that there's been a huge drawback of federal funding, particularly grant funding, that many schools essentially counted on to do new technology pilot programs. If you look at how most schools budget-wise distribute these monies, they're not digging into their core funding to do pilot tech programs. They're typically grant funded in nature. So once that disappears, the people say, well, how do we keep this going? So some of those fundings have moved away from private liberal arts schools. HBCUs have been recipient of a lot of funding, particularly given their historical connection to vocational and trade schools. And I think in that space, particularly the vocational and technical trade skill areas, given the demand, given the high salaries, that is going to be a core focus in the next couple of years, is largely based upon that demand, as well as the moving away to our kind of collective agreement that borrowing $100,000 for a sociology degree with no guarantee of employment beyond a barista job, that might not be the best way to go, right? And not to call out people's hopes and dreams, that that's what you want to do, go for it. But there are some other viable professional tracks that cost less, make way more money, and might be something that's not familiar, but it's an opportunity nonetheless.
What part of the business has scaled the fastest over the last few years?
I think the part that scaled the fastest is probably the K through 12 division. If I look back 3 or 4 years ago, higher ed was kind of in the lead for a while, and I think largely due to pretty generous grant funding from the federal government. And then K through 12 is typically slightly slower in adoption than higher ed, but they've come on strong here in the last 18 months to 2 years, and we're really starting to see, particularly through kind of non-traditional K through 12 education. So that might be a charter school, that might be a private religious school, that might be a micro school, which are all fairly recent iterations of public education or K through 12 education. And those have really started to build up programs because, one, they're not traditional institutions, so they can move a little bit quicker, they're more flexible, and they're also trying to redefine what it means in that K through 12 space. So, for example, starting a school premised on the idea that it's going to be mixed modality, that it's going to be some in person, some online, or some schools that are totally online, right? That's not something that any publicly funded state school will be able to do in the near term, given structures and precedent. So, I think that's where we've seen the greatest growth in the last couple of years in scaling in terms of adoption.
Okay. On a flip side, what parts of scaling extra education company has been difficult than more difficult?
Yeah, I think the difficulty is when educators, typically pretty smart, well-informed people, have some intentional self-deluding around stated objectives and outcomes and then formulation of practice. So let me give an example, right? If you do a statistical analysis, right, in a study, let's say, and you wanted to test whether a new technology is going to work well at a college or university, any professor has probably taken a statistics course. So if you say, I want to be 90% certain, right, that this technology is going to work, then you go back to your process. Well, how do I get to 90% degree certainty? Well, I need a sample size of close to 300 individuals because my stated goal is this. To get to my stated goal, here are the steps. Problem is, a lot of schools say, well, we want to be very certain. And I say, okay, great, let's get a pilot program. And they say, well, okay, let's get 10 people in that pilot program. Well, anyone who's ever taken a statistics course knows that it's impossible to get to a 90% degree certainty with a sample size of only 10. So from the beginning, they have shot themselves in the foot, fallen into a logic trap of, well, our standards are up here, but what we're willing to do to meet those standards basically sinks the ship from the beginning, right? You'll never get there. So that dissonance between stated goals and processes to reach those stated goals, I think, is the biggest impediment to schools doing this right. It's pretty easy fix, right? One, run a pilot program and build in metrics that you can measure, qualitative and quantitative. You go to any boss at any company and say, boss, I just did this study. I think it works. Give me more money, right? The first thing the boss is going to say is, where's the evidence, right? Show me the proof, right? And so many schools are conducting pilot programs, not building in any measurable metrics to justify the adoption of these programs. So that's certainly frustrating. And I feel that, again, that should be a space that most academics would recognize as an issue and resolve. Unfortunately, most of them don't. And I think it's a pretty easy fix, to be honest. Now, I think if you read between the lines, there's also some other things, and this really revolves around human nature. In modern America, I believe modern Americans are comfort seekers, right? That everyone is focused their energy around creating the most amount of comfort and leisure, which again, I love comfort and leisure. But if that means not participating in new initiatives, not continuing your education, not proactively engaging with, your organization to, raise the bar of performance, you might just be standing in the way. And there's going to have to be a reckoning at some point as we all learn to keep pace with modern technology and societies. Are academics and teachers willing to do that too? And to what rate? And I'll give an example. During the pandemic, most schools said, hey, look, tough times. If you want to stay in this job, you got to learn new technologies. That's just it. And for the people who are not okay with that, they retired early or they found a different job. And that agreement for educational institutions, I assume, still holds true. That wasn't just a pandemic thing. That was a going forward in the future thing. And, I think that people still, memories are short, but I assume that agreement still holds true for most jobs, just in academia. I think there's a reckoning personally that people are going to have to come to that in the modern era and the pace of technology, continuing education is not optional. It's a fundamental requirement for being able to stay current and deliver on your responsibilities.
Which key metrics or indicators do you watch most closely when evaluating VictoryXR growth?
I mean, certainly the most important metric is really around a couple metrics, I guess. So, one, the growth rate and the expansion of our user base, right? In terms of total number of users. That's always a nice one. Second is the usage rate. How much are people actually logging in and using this app? I.e., are they staying in a very narrow lane? Are they spending, minutes, hours, days, right? And then, maybe the most important is, how many users are returning? Once that expiration, the ARR hits, how many people are re-upping and coming back or expanding those programs? I think that's probably the strongest indicator of growth is, you know, are people coming back, right? Are people buying more? So those are three of the main ones that we look at, but I don't think you can just look at those in a vacuum. Again, those are from a systems perspective impacted by internal decisions, external factors. So, you know, we try to keep those as our northern star, but we also want to keep our eyes open to see how factors are affecting those numbers, right? Either internally or externally.
When deploying immersive educational solutions at scale, what tends to be the biggest operational challenge? Technology, adoption, training, or something else?
I'd say the biggest challenge is probably training. And at the end of the day, if you ask a teacher, how's it going? They're probably going to say something like, John, feeling overworked and underpaid. I don't really have any time to learn anything new, but if you force me to do it, it better be really well supported and it be very clear how it's going to make my life easier. Otherwise, I'm probably just going to slow walk into failure because I don't want to do it. That's where a lot of teachers' heads are at these days. So, what you have to make clear is one, this is not a journey you're going on alone. Two, we have excellent training and support, and that expands from not only asynchronous training material you can do at any time to meeting with our team, right? We'll put on the white gloves, we'll hold hands, and we'll go through step by step because, technology can be scary. right? It's new, right? It's also intimidating for some. To have good guidance, training, and support, I think, is a pretty strong requirement for any successful program. But I was also add that really what makes that easy is a good culture at that institution. So if you have good leaders who are trying to drive change and initiatives, typically it works really well. There are other institutions that, they're just kind of going through the motions because their president said they're going to innovate and they got to do something, right? So they got to move some pieces around, but I don't really see the desire and the volition there. And it's largely because probably people say, this isn't for me. And if I can avoid doing it, I'm going to avoid doing it. And again, can't control everyone's behavior, but you can set the tone, you can set the goals, and you can say, hey, this is what we're doing. And I think universities need to take a little bit harder line with setting expectations and particularly outcomes, because again, you don't have an indefinite timeline to make these adjustments.
If you could automate or drastically improve one part of your internal operations, what would it be?
Well, you can always use more manpower strategically placed. I think that, any challenge, well, the challenge that we face is similar in scope to many other companies. That if you want to work in technology, a prerequisite for that is the ground is always going to be shifting underneath your feet with new advancements, new directions, new attentions, right? And just one example, Meta has started to draw back a little bit from their VR and education programs. That's an internal decision. I think maybe sales of the headsets were below their expectations. So we worked closely with Meta before. Now we're trying to assess, okay, how do we position and continue that collaboration? But now you're seeing some other players come into the market, right? As Meta draws back, you have Pico, you have Vive trying to take up some of that market share, perhaps. So you have to be agile. You have to be adaptive, right? You have to be open minded. You have to keep things on the table until you can't, right? And that could be, initiatives, that could be personnel that you're trying to maintain some dynamic stasis, right? So that you can deal with not only the new elements of technology, but how that draws people's gaze, right, in those changes to new things, new opportunities.
Okay. Um, let's see. What areas of your business currently require the most manual effort from your team?
I think manual effort really is technically, I guess you'd put it under kind of lead generation, but I would go one step beyond that, right? And kind of goes back to a point I made earlier, which is for new technology, this isn't trying to convince someone to go from Coke to Pepsi, right? People know what both of those things are. It's just a matter of preference and taste. We do a lot of education. So whether that's a webinar, a demo, that we're actually going out there and teaching people what this is before we try to make an attempt at convincing them to purchase it. So I think the educational part that has elements of lead generation, but also marketing and, due to the nature of this industry is, got to educate people.
Okay. All right. So let's switch gears here a little bit. With AI evolving rapidly, where do you see the largest opportunity for AI inside immersive educational platforms?
Well, that's a good question. I think, first it's going to nibble around the margins. Students at universities have been using AI for the last 18 months. And again, they're not just starting to use it. When I talk with professors, they're kind of at a loss as to how to provide guidance for students around these AI technologies. And that really centers around that there isn't any institutional guidance. If the institutional guidance is, hey, AI is bad, don't use it, well, good luck. How does that work when you tell kids, don't ever smoke a cigarette, don't ever drink a beer, right? People are naturally going to be attracted to what they're told that they can't use, right?
Exactly.
That's part of growing up in adolescence. So, is we look at how this is nibbling around the edges. First, it's me used in composition, writing, um, homework, research, test prep. But, as you look at how, for example, Claude is being utilized, it's quickly going to move and already has moved into supporting research, data analyzation, data visualization, and it's going to be a core component of any researchers or academics toolkit going forward. And I think most schools are okay with the added computing power for research. What they're struggling with is how do we frame the engagement with our students to show that this is a tool and a very powerful one, but it has to be used responsibly. and it has to be used within the frame of engagement that the institution or school is setting up. And there's only a limited window to do that before people say, you know what, screw it. I'm going to come up with my own parameters of engagement, right? I'm going to use this whenever I feel like it. And I think a lot of students right now are frustrated because their institution hasn't really moved beyond, hey, this is bad. Don't use it. And I don't think that's going to work in the long term. So, first with basic classroom, study, testing, stuff like that, and then more and more research is going to be highly dependent upon AI capabilities.
If we fast forward 10 years, what does the ideal immersive classroom experience look like?
Well, that's a good question. I think ideally, if it's an immersive classroom, it is by definition not localized. And so, again, if I can join a great immersive classroom, why am I going to drive in 45 minutes to campus to go to a room when I could do that here at my apartment or my house? And so, I think in 10 years, the ideal environment is going to be omnipresent, right? So accessible to anyone, anywhere, assuming they have connectivity. The fidelity is going to be incredible. Right now, what's really holding back a lot of those immersive experiences is the processing power of the graphics chips in a lot of the hardware, right? So bandwidth is there, the development capabilities are there, but the problem is if you want to have a small mobile computer, there's an upper bound of its system and processing powers to create that fidelity. But in 10 years, it's going to be incredibly crisp and clear. You're going to be hard pressed, I think, in 10 years to accurately and consistently determine what's user generated and what's AI generated, right? Given the developments we've seen in the last year, at the end of the day, I think it's going to be everything on demand. Every amateur wants to be an expert, right? But they don't want to put in the work. Where we're going with AI is, you're going to be able to be, at least on the surface, appear as an expert, given the power in that technology, the ability to task it to bring up a data visualization of this health and epidemic report around measles in South Carolina. Now, I want you to cross-reference that over here with the measles outbreak in Zimbabwe in 1984. You'll be able to basically, at will, without specialized skills, manipulate, iterate, and generate data, visualization, and information on the fly. And I think it's going to be pretty cool.
What would success look like for VictoryXR in the next 5, 10 years?
That's a good question. I think success-wise is a couple different lanes. So, one, obviously expansion of user base. And the way that we do that is going back to the hardest part of this job is you got to educate. You got to teach people what this is so they can make an informed decision. So expanding our reach, increasing the number of countries we operate in, be honest, the future of a lot of innovation, some of it will occur in the United States, but a lot of it will occur in the MENA region. A lot of it will in Africa. Because if you look at the populations of those places, they got a lot of young people. I think we'd be remiss to say that it's only going to be localized in Western Europe or America. So really getting into those growing and new markets to provide them with the tools, expanding to capital projects. And what I mean by that is looking at projects that are essentially sponsored by nation states, right? Building police and crime simulations for a Southeast Asian country, building a religious interactive game for a Middle Eastern country around a holiday. We're starting to encroach into those areas, and I think those will put us on the map in terms of being able to show that you really can do anything with us. In addition, continue to build a team, right? That, you know, any startup company, I consider we're still a startup in many respects, is there's no mediocre people. Everyone's got 3 to 4 jobs. So it's always exciting, looking to bring on new talent, people with new skills and capabilities, and continue to grow that vision with their ability to help fold in their own skills into that. And yeah, it's exciting times. I think, if anyone said they know exactly where this is going to be in 10 years, I don't know if you'd believe them, but because I certainly wouldn't say that, but one can hope.
If you had a magic wand and could instantly fix one challenge in VictoryXR today, whether operational, technical, or strategic,
Mhm.
what would that be?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that, given a small team, just going to what I just mentioned, if I could wave a magic wand, I would love some more seed funding with no strings attached, right? That there's always areas that you've got to plug holes in, like a leaky ship, and those change consistently. So if we have a heavy pipeline in development, hey, we need some more developers, right? If we're struggling on the sales, let's beef up lead generation. So I would say if I could wave a wand on any respect, it would be the ability for people to just with an open mind engage around this technology that is certainly going to impact their life. And again, we're all creatures of habit. We're all have our detriments in terms of putting our time and energy into things. So if I could give people a little bit more volition to have an open mind and just look at a technology and say, okay, how could this impact me in my life and my role? I'd appreciate that if they spend a little bit more time thinking deeply.
Interesting. Okay. Now, what advice would you give to educators or institutions considering immersive learning technology today?
I think if you're trying to get something going in your own neck of the woods, that, here's some general advice that I find to be part of successful programs we've worked with. So one, someone's got to be the champion. It might not be you. And if it's not, you got to find it, right? So find an advocate, a champion who is going to celebrate your work and provide basically support around moving it forward. Second, quality over quantity, right? That a lot of institutions invariably, if you bring in a ton of people, some people in that group are not going to be excited about what's going on, right? And in the worst case, they might even try to sabotage that work. So pick a couple good people. That will get you a lot more traction and allies than forcing people to do things that they don't want to do, right? I say pulling teeth, but if someone doesn't want to do something, you're not going to get much out of them if you force them to, right? The third thing is, have current you look out for future you, right? So how do you future proof yourself in an initiative around technology? Well, you bake in data and metrics that you can measure so that when you get to the end of it, you do have some definitive conclusion or at least good data to try to draw a conclusion from. So don't just dive in. Think about what problems are we trying to solve? What is our goal here? And if you can articulate that, then you can easily build in metrics to measure towards those goals. I guess the last piece that I would say is that everything's on the table until it's not. And we all have areas of expertise, but I always tell people, hey, I got a lot of great ideas here because I do this a lot. But if you have an idea, let's put it on the table, right? That any great collaboration is a two-way street. You have to work together. I don't want to just tell people what to do. I want to have people say, that's a good idea. Here's another idea, right? And that compounding two-way communication for me is always the key to success and moving things forward in a meaningful way. So that would be the advice that I would give a new program.
And that's a fantastic advice. Thank you for sharing. And finally, what's one prediction you have about the future of education and immersive technology that most people still underestimate?
It's a great question. I think one element that people haven't really wrapped their minds around yet, it goes back to a little bit to my point, is that, you know, my analogy with the calculator can be used for a lot of different things. I really don't think people have wrapped their minds around the depth and breadth of what you can use, particularly AI for. That, people have had a little, they've seen a commercial during a football game, or, maybe they saw their kid playing around with asking a few questions. Once you start diving into what it can do, I mean, it's pretty fantastical. If you went back, 2 years and said, hey, in 2 years, you're going to be able to do this, most people say, no way, you're crazy. So, I think people really have to get locked in that at the end of the day, this tool is pretty much for everybody. Certainly, there are a few things that it's not going to do well at, but spend a little bit of free play and due diligence. Check it out. But when people say, John, is this going to steal my job? My advice is always this: do your research. Go in, spend an hour, and see if it applies to you and what you do, right? If the answer is yes, read more. Don't stop. If the answer is no, this doesn't really apply to me, check back in 6 months, because in 6 months it might apply to you. And as much as we'd all like to just tune out, I don't think you can do that anymore professional. You can't skate by for a decade on the skills you learned back there and not be willing to learn anything new.
Unless you're doing plumbing,
That's true.
probably,
It's true.
which is still very high in demand today.
It is, and, some days I think, "Well, maybe I should have been a plumber," but I like technology and
Yeah.
education too much.
Yeah.
There's something for everybody out there, and again, it's a journey to find it.
Well, John, has been absolutely fantastic having you on a podcast. I love the insights and the feedback you provided and hope to see you again. And by the way, how can people find you?
You can find me at John, John, at victoryxr.com.
Perfect. It's been a pleasure. We'll chat soon. Thank you.